judge has blocked nationwide part of President Trump's executive order on immigration. The part that's blocked, the threat to keep federal money away from so-called sanctuary cities, jurisdictions that don't fully cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. Now, just today at the White House, Sean Spicer was talking about the sanctuary city provision as one of the president's victories in his first 100 days.
All told, he has signed 28 pieces of legislation. And it's not just through legislation that the president has made serious progress on his top priorities. The president promised to enforce our nation's borders. His attorney general, Homeland Security, and their staffs have been working around the clock to fulfill that promise. He has directed a halt of federal funding to jurisdictions that do not comply with federal immigration laws.
Well, just hours after he said that, a federal judge in California blocked that part of the executive order. Joining me on the panel tonight is Kirsten Powers, Matt Lewis, Laura Coates, and Elizabeth Foley. Kirsten, I mean, it certainly seems another big setback for President Trump in terms of his first 100 days. I mean, this was something that Sean Spicer just today was touting as one of the accomplishments.
Yeah, and this was one of the executive orders that was done when he did this spate of executive orders around the travel ban, which means it was also not vetted in much the way the travel ban wasn't vetted. And if you look at some of the issues that the judge raised in terms of the constitutional issues, these are sort of basic, almost constitutional 101 kind of things that probably, if he'd had more, people with expertise poring over this may have addressed that. And so I think that just the basic one is the separation of powers, that basically this is the power of the purse belongs to the Congress. And so this is not actually something that the president can do, as an executive order. Congress would have to pass some sort of law before he could do something like this.
Matt, it's also much more limited. I mean, what's interesting is, the president announced this great fanfare as an executive order, made it sound like all federal funds would be stopped to these cities. What the Department of Justice in the subsequent months was arguing to this court was basically it's going to be 3 grants. And the judge said you can already, under the terms of those grants, you can limit the funding under those grants. The judge didn't buy the whole notion that all federal funds would be stopped to these cities.
Right, and I think it's technical and detailed, and this will be litigated. But I think the larger question is where I'm with Donald Trump, and I think the American people are. I mean, number one, the federal government decides and sets immigration law. Number two, these cities are unilaterally deciding not to enforce federal law. Number three, President Trump is duly elected and has the authority to issue executive orders that deal with the implementation of federal law. I think it's I think it's perfectly reasonable for the federal government to withhold funds from cities and counties that are not following the rule of law and are not complying with federal law.
Laura, what do you think about that?
Well, it's not unilateral. There is a 10th Amendment that allows states to say that you cannot commandeer our state and local police officers. And also the Supreme Court in 2012, when it dealt with the issue of an Obamacare, Medicare expansion, said, listen, you cannot condition federal funding in a coercive way that it's akin to placing a gun to the head of these states. If they were to condition the funds in advance of the states accepting the money, then it would be a valid exercise of their power. But here, they're trying to take the rug out from under the actual states and saying, now that we've changed our minds, you must now comply with what was not required of you when you first took the funding. And that's the judge's focus here. It's very, very narrow, and why the Department of Justice responded in the way that it did. It comes down to the 10th Amendment and the idea, which is when you saw them say, using it as a weapon, it's a nod to the very conservative justices who already said, you cannot do this. That's the funny thing about precedent. It works both ways.
Professor Foley, was this California court right?
I think he was. This is basically Constitutional Law 101. As Kirsten said, the power of the purse does belong solely to Congress and not to the president. Now, having said that, this policy of withholding federal funds from sanctuary cities can be carried out by Congress, but Congress does have to abide by existing Supreme Court precedent, including a case called South Dakota versus Dole, which set forth sort of a roadmap as to how Congress can put strings on the receipt of federal funds. I wrote an opinion editorial in the Los Angeles Times a couple months ago that basically told Congress how it can do this. And I think if it abides by that roadmap and dots its I's and crosses its T's, it can give President Trump a longer-term legal victory rather than this sort of short-term ephemeral PR victory that he apparently was going for.
So, Professor Foley, was this just, I mean, I don't know if incompetence is too strong a word, but just a botched job by the White House to get this executive order out without actually thinking it through?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't want to judge them too much because you always make a lot of mistakes in early days of administrations. But I will say I think the Trump administration was getting some political pressure to throw some bones to its base. And that was a short-term, sort of ephemeral PR victory. Now they have to sort of play the long game here on a lot of these issues because it's quite clear that unlike a lot of other administrations, this Trump administration is going to face serious legal challenges to almost every major move it makes. So it better play the long-term legal game.
Kirsten, I mean, it's pretty stunning.
Yeah.
If that's the case, that I mean, just like with the 7-country ban.
Well, I mean, I think the legal experts can probably speak to this a little bit more, but the judge raised 5 different constitutional objections to this, which seems like a lot in an executive order. You know, you have the separation of powers, you have violating the spending clause, unduly coercive, which we heard under the 10th Amendment, and then 2 Fifth Amendment violations. One is void for vagueness, meaning that there really was no explanation to the states of how they could not run afoul of this. And then another Fifth Amendment violation was there was no notice to be heard and to basically appeal this. I mean, that's a lot of constitutional violations in one executive order.
Also, Matt, the White House has said when they put this out that a definition of what a sanctuary city would be forthcoming. It's been 3 months.
Yeah.
I just talked to the mayor of Los Angeles. He doesn't know what their definition of a sanctuary city is, and they've gotten really no clarification on it.
Yeah, and obviously that's them. That's incompetence. I think it's funny that liberals are now defenders of states' rights and not, keeping the big bad federal government from overreaching. Look, very clearly what these cities, these sanctuary cities, are doing is unilaterally deciding not to enforce federal law.
But to the argument
I agree that Congress,
to the argument that the mayor of Los Angeles makes, which is they want people to report crimes, even if they're undocumented. They don't want people, not bringing charges against somebody who's abusing them.
That's a perfectly valid argument, except we have something called the rule of law. The federal law says that you cannot come into this country illegally, and they are choosing to not abide by the Department of Justice.
Matt, you're mistaken. But you're mistaken here on one issue. Hold on.
Rudy Giuliani did this. I mean, this is he's a law and order person. Rudy Giuliani had a sanctuary city, and he explained for all the reasons that you need to be able to, for all the reasons we know, that you need people to report crimes. He did not, this is not, and the whole, this is a liberal thing. This is nothing, this isn't even an ideal, what I outlined is not an ideological statement. It really is Constitution 101. It's
I would say I agree. I would love to see Congress deal with this because that's how you actually change it long term anyway.
Right. Laura?
Well, the thing about it is you're missing a policy perspective, Matt, and that is this. As a former prosecutor, it's not about just reporting crimes. There are prosecutorial priorities that state and local officers have and are trying to abide by. And for the federal government to come in and say that we're going to restructure those priorities or order them according to our campaign rhetoric, perhaps, is really an undermining of what the legal objectives are of a prosecutor's office. Their goal is not simply to tout or flout the law. Their goal is to enforce the priorities they have about trying to minimize and solve violent crimes. And you can all agree that being an undocumented immigrant in and of itself is by far never a violent crime.
Well, look at the San Francisco case where there was a guy who was deported multiple times and came back and ended up killing. He was illegal and ended up killing an American citizen.
You're right. The crime he committed was, in fact, violent. But the actual policy defense that these states are enforcing and these cities are saying is that they're trying to prioritize solving crimes like that do exist. But in and of itself, trying to reallocate their funding and the priorities in order to accommodate the federal government without having funding is going to jeopardize the ability to achieve the law and order that you speak of.
We got to take a break. I want to thank everybody. We're obviously going to be following this as it moves through the courts, and then that's obviously where this is heading. More breaking news, new questions tonight about payments former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn got from Russia and Turkey. The chair of the House Oversight